כן, ועכשיו אנחנו רוצים לעבור לראיון שקיימתי מוקדם יותר עם דניאל פייפס, יושב ראש פורום המזרח התיכון, ראיון מיוחד שקיימתי איתו מארצות הברית. בואו נראה. Good evening to Daniel Pipes, president of the Middle East Forum and a leading researcher on the Middle East and its security concerns.
Good evening.
In the 1990s, during the Oslo Accords negotiations, you were among the first to warn that the Rabin government's approach of peace is made with enemies was fundamentally incorrect and will only lead to war, not peace. What is your take on it?
Well, you can't make peace with an enemy who's still your enemy. He's your enemy. You can only make peace with a former enemy, someone who's given up being your enemy. Think, say, of World War II. We couldn't make peace with Hitler. We could make peace with Hitler's successors, who are no longer our enemies. Likewise, with the Palestinians, Israel can only make peace with the Palestinians once they're no longer Israel's enemies, once they've come to accept the existence of the Jewish state. Then, sure, then the terms of Oslo would be reasonable. But so long as that enmity continues, then it makes no sense.
Also today we are seeing the beginning maybe of negotiations with the Palestinians. Do you believe that Israel still operates based on the perception that peace is made with enemies?
No, I don't think so. I think there's been a profound change over the past 20 years. I think the naivete, the innocence of the period before the Al-Aqsa Intifada, as it's known, before 2000, September 2000, is over. That was a 7-year period from 1993 to 2000, September to September, easy to remember. And since then, there's been increased skepticism and realism on the part of Israelis. Now, there's still some who have that old naive view, but they're a small minority. To put it differently, if you look at the Knesset today, over 2/3 of the Knesset is basically skeptical of making an agreement with the Palestinians so long as they are still hostile to the existence of the Jewish state.
Yes, many people take a black and white approach to the war against terrorism and believe that it can't be uprooted and is unsolvable. Do you believe that Israel has a way to significantly defeat terror groups without engaging in a total war?
Let's look at the bigger picture. The main enemies of Israel for the first 25 years of its existence, from 1948 to 1973, were the states: Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and beyond them, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the states. But there's been no war with a state for, 48 years now? I mean, there were little fights, skirmishes with Syria, but nothing serious. The Israelis won their war against the Arab states. That is quite an achievement. These are states with significant military forces, in fact, larger military forces than Israel's. Instead, Israel now faces the Palestinians. It's more of a guerrilla war. And just as Israel defeated the states, it can defeat the Palestinians. It can cause the Palestinians to realize that they can't win. It can cause them a sense of defeat. I believe that's possible. Wars end in general when one side gives up. Unfortunately, the Israelis, although there's been a big improvement over the past 2 decades, have not come fully to this conclusion yet that the war has to be won. It's not a matter of agreements. It's not a matter of paying money. It's not a matter of some clever scheme. It's a matter of convincing the Palestinians that the war is over, they have lost, and it's time to come to terms with the Jewish state. That has to be the goal.
When you look at Gaza today, what goal do you think that Israel should set for itself?
Well, what's interesting about Gaza is that Israel has no goal. I mean, if you ask me, what's the Israeli goal in Gaza? I'm hoping that things stay quiet. There is no goal. The goal should be to convince Gazans, whether they be Hamas or Islamic Jihad or just regular people making a living, that the war is over and they lost. There's no possibility of their achieving their goals. They need to come to terms with Israel. And once they do, they'll get lots of benefits. Their polity, economy, society, and culture will all flourish, or at least have the potential to flourish, once they stop making war on Israel. So the goal is to convince Gazans, you've lost. The war is over. Come to terms. Come to accept Israel. Get the benefits.
What is your opinion on the Qatari money entering Gaza?
I think it's a terrible idea. I think the Israeli position should be, Gazans, you want war? Okay, you've got war, and you're going to pay for it. Whether it be bombings from the air, as happened in May, or economic suffering. You want war? You got war. Not going to send you money, not going to allow money to go to you. You made your bed, you got to lie in it. You've decided on war, okay, you've got war. You wanted to end the war, then you'll get all sorts of benefits. But so long as you continue at war, no, you don't get benefits.
Today we see that despite the Abraham Accords, some of Israel's enemies are still looking to destroy the country. What is your take on it?
Well, the Abraham Accords were a very positive development, but they were somewhat peripheral development. After all, Bahrain, UAE, Sudan, and Morocco are not the key actors in this fight. Good, great, only positive. But the key actor now is the Palestinians, to a lesser extent, the Syrian government. And the Palestinians need to be convinced that they have lost. Abraham Accords didn't achieve that. No agreement with an Arab state or any state will achieve that. It has to be the Palestinians themselves, the Palestinians specifically of the West Bank and Gaza, who come to this conclusion. The war is not going well. They've lost it. Time to come to terms with the Jewish state and stop making war on it. Stop making war on it, whether it be jihadi violence or whether it be United Nations resolutions. Stop making war on it. Accept it. Deal with it. And by the way, this is of enormous importance to Israel, because if you look at the Israeli security situation, there are two different aspects to it. One is the actual military threat coming predominantly from Iran, which is very, very important. But the second is the political threat, the animosity, the extraordinary hostility towards Israel, in particular on the left and also among Muslims. That is generated by concern about Palestinians. It's the Palestinians who create that hostility. If the Palestinians themselves of Gaza and the West Bank came to terms with Israel, then I believe that hostility, that global hostility to Israel on the left and among Muslims would diminish, if not disappear, because it's all generated by the Palestinians. It's not generated by Iran. It's not generated by economic inequality in Israel. It's not generated by the Arabs of Israel. It's generated by the West Bank and Gaza Palestinians. So that needs to be solved. And the only way to solve that is by getting them to concede that Israel's there, permanent, tough, not going anywhere, and they come to terms with it.
The United States left Afghanistan in a very surprising way and left a large amount of weapons and military equipment. Do you think this will have an impact on Israel?
No doubt. The catastrophe the American military force underwent in Afghanistan is very negative in a military sense, in a jihadi sense. The extremists the wild-eyed, violent extremists will prosper, will use the weaponry and will be enthused. But I think there's another consequence, which I don't hear anyone talking about other than me, which is that this development in Afghanistan last month causes Muslims around the world to say, "Ooh, this is bad, this is terrible. I'm sure glad I don't live in Afghanistan. I sure don't like the Taliban. I sure don't like Islamism." And by the way, I think that was a factor in the elections yesterday in Morocco, which were spectacular. The Islamist party in Morocco, last election, got 125 seats, 1/3 of the parliament. Yesterday, provisional reports show it got 12 seats, 10%. Now, I'm not going to ascribe that all to Afghanistan, but I would say that Afghanistan is a factor there. Muslims are looking at Afghanistan saying, no thanks, we don't want to live under Islamist rule.
Overall, are you optimistic?
About what?
About the situation, about Israel?
Overall, I'm very optimistic about Israel. I think Israel is a remarkable country that's doing extraordinarily well. For me, the most spectacular development in Israel is the over 3 children per woman birth rate, which is amazing. It's going up. Nowhere else in the developed world is that happening. The water, the move towards political realism, all this is great. My worry is that the left is ever more hostile to Israel. And that isn't changing. It's growing. And this would be a catastrophe for Israel. So Israel's problem is the Palestinian hostility, which generates a global hostility. Other than that, Israel's doing great, but that's a big problem.
Daniel Pipes, president of the Middle East Forum, thank you for granting us this interview.
My pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.